Yeah, so that would be a later name. Yes, yeah, it would be the same as the Mars. That came in Roman times, they say. Yeah. So I don't know what they actually would have called it then, but people today, well, when I went to school, they called it the Intercoastal Highway because it went along the coast and, yeah, it connected Egypt to those countries north and et cetera. Yeah. Yeah, so no, that's the same. Mm-hmm. Well, let's see if this works. Start. Okay. Okay, I'm ready. Okay, well, let us open our time together in prayer then. So let's pray. Lord God, just thank you very much for this day. Thank you very much for your word. Lord, I just ask that you will help us as we go through your word to get to know you better, to get to know your word better. Thank you, Lord. Amen. Okay, so today we are going to start at Jeremiah, Josiah, and go through the rest of the Bible. So there's a lot to cover. So you guys have been very gracious, hung in there. So we have a little bit more to go. So hopefully you won't get too tired. Okay, so let us look at. So we looked at Josiah last time, and we have Jeremiah the prophet, who began his prophecy in the 13th year of Josiah. But I wanted to talk, as long as I have this slide up, about kings that followed Josiah. So was Josiah a godly king or an ungodly king? He was a godly king, right? Now, he had different descendants of his follow him. And so this is his family tree. So the names in the yellow highlight, those are a couple of his wives. And so Jehoahaz and Zedekiah are full brothers. Jehoiakim and Jehoiachin, you can see they're half brothers to Jehoahaz and Zedekiah. And then Jehoiachin is a son of Jehoiakim. Okay, and so this is why the Old Testament and the divided monarchy is so confusing, because you have all these people that are Jehu, whatever, all these names, and it's like, well, oh my goodness, how many, can't they have different names like Bob, Harry, or John, or something like that? But again, if they did take a throne name, the Yehu at the beginning refers to the Lord. So it's a shortened form of Yahweh. Okay. And Zedekiah has the IAH at the end, or the AH at the end. Again, that's a shortened form of Yahweh, Yah. So Zedekiah, his name, Zedek, is righteous. And so his name actually means Yahweh is righteous. So all these names had significance. And again, maybe they were throne names and not given names when they were born. So a little bit about the history. During this time with Josiah, you have Egypt is one of the superpowers. You have Babylon over to the west. That's another superpower. And so Egypt is trying to keep Babylon contained. And so they want to help. The Assyrian government is very weak. They've been conquered by the Babylonians. But Egypt wants to prop up what's left. They're a government in exile now. And so Egypt needs to go north and fight a battle in the north against the Babylonians, which means he has to go through Jerusalem, Judah. And remember did we talk about it? Maybe we didn't talk about it. Josiah goes out and engages him in battle, and Josiah is mortally wounded, and he dies with that encounter. Now, the Pharaoh comes back through, and he ends up placing, the people had put one of Josiah's sons on the throne. They had put Jehoahaz on the throne. Pharaoh Necho hauls Jehoahaz off to Egypt and puts Jehoiakim, another son, a half-brother of Jehoahaz, on the throne. And during this time, Daniel and his 3 friends are hauled off into exile. So Judah has 3 exiles. The first one is Daniel and his friends go, and we'll come to the others. The second, Ezekiel, it suggested goes. The third one, 3 strikes, you're out. Okay, then Judah goes down as an independent nation, and it becomes a Babylonian province. So, Jehoiakim is not somebody who really loves the Lord. Turn in your Bibles to Jeremiah 36. Jeremiah 36. So, Jeremiah 36. Jehoiakim has rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king, and it is his 4th year now of reign. And Jeremiah, in verse 2, is told to take a scroll. Remember, they didn't have books then. They had scrolls because books weren't invented till after the time of Christ. And so they had a scroll, and he was supposed to write on it, verse 2, all that God had spoken to him concerning Israel and Judah. And so this would end up being over 20 years of information he is supposed to write down. Now, he doesn't write it down, but in verse 4, he dictates it to a scribe, Baruch. So Baruch is the one that actually physically writes the words that Jeremiah gives him. And they are supposed to then go and read this scroll to the people. Now, as we think about this, God is telling them, basically, as you look at other parts of Jeremiah, get your act together or you're going down. Okay, so you're off, you're not following me. I'm going to bring you down if you don't straighten up. So that's kind of the gist of the scroll. And in verse 7, in verses 3 and 7, notice God's desire. So what does he want? He wants people to turn. Okay? So again, God does not take delight in taking people out, even if they are sinning against him. What does he want? He wants them to come back. So he wants them, they're going this direction. He wants them to do an about face and come back to him. Now, we're getting towards the end of Jeremiah is the last prophet. He's alive when the southern kingdom falls. So we're getting towards the end of the time. But still, God wants them to come back to him. That's what he hopes. Okay. Now, verse 9, 5th year of Jehoiakim. They are able to read this scroll, and eventually they decide that they need to read it to the king. And so in verse 22, the king is sitting in his winter house, the 9th month. So it's a little chilly, so it has a little fire going to take off the chill. And when you when you do a scroll, you write in columns. Okay, it's not like a book where you turn the pages, but you roll it and unroll it. So you actually write in columns as you have a scroll. So notice, as 3 or 4 columns were read, then what did the king do? Verse 23, cuts it with a scribe's knife and throws it into the little fire that was going there to take off the chill. and does that until the entire scroll is burned up. In verse 24, we're told that the king and all his servants who heard these words were not afraid, and they did not tear their garments. Now, why would you rip a perfectly good garment? It seems kind of dumb, doesn't it? Would you guys rip a perfectly good garment? Exactly. So to show that they're repentant. And so this was not going to work well for Jehoiakim. So when we go down to 27 and following, Jeremiah needs to, God tells him to write another scroll. And so he does that. And Jehoiakim, verse 29, you burned this scroll, saying, why have you written on it that the king of Babylon will certainly come and destroy this land and make human and animals cease from it? And therefore, this is what the Lord says. There will be no one to sit on his throne of his descendants, and his body will be desecrated. It will not be properly buried. And so Jeremiah writes another scroll and adds more words. Okay, and then Jehoiakim has a son, Jehoiachin. His dad dies, and he takes over the throne, and he lasts for 3 months. He only has a 3-month reign, so it's pretty short. It's suggested then that Ezekiel was taken at this point in time. And then this is the last king. Zedekiah is the last king of Judah. He eventually rebels against Babylon. Babylon then begins to lay siege to Jerusalem. Again, what does it look like when you lay siege to a city?
Cut it off from the outside.
Yep. And so Jerusalem would have had walls around it. That's what they did in those days for defense. So you'd build walls around your cities. Do anything you could to make it so when the army came against it, your walls would protect you. Remember, Hezekiah made it so the water came inside the walls? Okay, so why do you do that? So pretend this is Jerusalem right here. And what the army does, then the Babylonians, they surround the city so that nobody can come in or out. So you can't go out and get food. If your water source was outside the city, Jerusalem's on a hill. Obviously, water is going to find the lowest point and go out towards the bottom of the hill, which is why Hezekiah reroutes the spring, or makes it so it goes to the pool of Siloam inside the walls. So Nebuchadnezzar is out there laying siege to Jerusalem. He's done. It's time for it to go down. It takes him, finally goes down in 586, so a couple of years, but he is successful. And Jeremiah is telling them to give up, so we'll look at Jeremiah more. I don't know, I kind of like archaeology. I kind of think it's cool that we have things that go way, way back, and they deal with things that are found in the Bible. So in Old Testament times, do you know what their scratch paper was? You guys use scratch paper? It's probably going to be a thing of the past because you just put notes on your phone. Okay, so you do notes on your phone, right? They would use broken pieces of pottery. They would write notes on broken pieces of pottery. And the cool thing about broken pieces of pottery is they don't rot when they fall in the ground. So they have found these broken pieces of pottery here and there. And this is what they look like. And one of these broken pieces of pottery mentions that they couldn't see any fire signals from a nearby city. So these cities would be built on the top of hills, and they would start a fire so that you would know that that city was still alive. The enemy hadn't conquered it because they're not that far apart. Everything in Israel is super, super, super small. Okay, so, and it suggested that the city of Lachish was conquered by Nebuchadnezzar before they could send the letters. You remember Sennacherib? He also conquered Lachish, so it guarded the entrance from the intercoastal highway into Jerusalem. So you have the highway, the Mediterranean Sea here, and then you would have roads that would go up to Jerusalem. So Lachish was the main one. Okay, that was the best one. And so it was a very, very strong city, but Nebuchadnezzar was able to conquer it, just like Sennacherib had conquered it before. And so Jerusalem falls. And you can you see on there, Lachish? See it down there? Lachish. That's the city we're talking. Can you guys see this okay? Is it good? Okay, so that happens in 586. Okay, now let's go look at Jeremiah. Okay. Okay, we'll just whip down here. Oops, no, we don't want to. Okay. So let us look at Jeremiah. Well, a couple things. Well, Jeremiah 7 we're going to go to. But a couple things to know about Jeremiah. He was called at a very young age to be a prophet for the Lord. And one of the things that God eventually told him is that he could not get married or have children. Now, today's culture, if God told you you couldn't get married, is that the worst thing in the world? I'm single. I've been single all my life. Never got married. I don't have any kids to call my own. I have nieces and nephews. I'm okay with it. But in those days, it was very, very, very unusual. That it was expected. That's what you did. You got married. You had a family. You had children. That was very, very, very important. So God said you can't do that. Why? Because what's going to happen is these kids are going to end up being hauled off into exile because Babylon is coming. They're going to take down Judah. Now, in Jeremiah chapter 7, the word of the Lord comes to Jeremiah, and he's supposed to stand in the Lord's house, so in the temple. In the temple where you go to worship the Lord. And so in church, right? He's supposed to go in church, except it's a little different there because people mill around in the outer courtyards, and then they can go offer their sacrifices. Sometimes they would have services where everybody would be paying attention to what was going on, but other times you just have all sorts of different things going on. And so he is there, and he says, verse 4, don't trust in deceptive words, saying, this is a temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. What does he mean by that? So if you are an ancient Judite at this time, the temple is God's house. Now, what should they do? Should a God protect their house or let the enemy come and take it out? Protect their house, right? So this is God's house. The temple is God's house. Of course he's going to protect it. He's not going to let it fall. And so the people were confident in this is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. It's not going to go down because God will protect his house. And Jeremiah says, don't trust in deceptive words, but what you need to do is change your actions or it will go down. Don't oppress, verse 6, the foreigner, the orphan, the widow. Don't shed innocent blood in this place. Don't walk after other gods. And then you will dwell in the land. Verse 9, will you steal, murder, commit adultery, swear falsely, offer sacrifices to Baal, walk after other gods you have not known, then come and stand before me in this house which is called by my name and say, we are delivered? Okay, doesn't really work, right? So when we come to church, have we lived a wild life? Have we just cheated somebody? Been unethical in our business, et cetera, and then we go to church and think everything's okay? No, right? I mean, there are consequences to our sin. The idea is we're supposed to walk in a way that honors God. And when we don't walk in a way that honors God, we need to get our act together, right? And get back to God. And so God is saying to these people, okay, you're not living in a way that honors me. You need to get your act together, because as Jeremiah says, I have no problem taking this place down. So go to verse 14. I'm going to do to this house which is called by my name, in which you trust, to the place I gave you and your ancestors, as I did to Shiloh. Okay, well, what does that mean? Have you ever heard of Shiloh before? Okay, and what happened at Shiloh? Yes, okay. So it's in Samuel, and in Samuel, that is a place where they worship God, in Shiloh. Okay, that was a place God had his house. In this case, it was a tent, not a building like this. The Ark of the Covenant goes down when they're having a battle against the Philistines. The Philistines capture the Ark of the Covenant. It's a funny story, I think. And so the Philistines bring the Ark of the Covenant back into their camp, take it to their cities, and they are pumped, because if they have this special piece of furniture, I mean, they conquered Israel and Israel's deity. So this is cool. So in 1 Samuel 4 and 5, it talks about this. And so they take the ark, 1 Samuel 5, they take it and bring it to one of their cities, Ashdod, and they set it up in the temple of Dagon. And they get up the next morning, and what happened? Dagon fell over. Okay, so this is not good. Now, this is their deity, okay? So Dagon fell over, so they had to put Dagon back up again. Needs a little help there, the deity does. Now, they go the next morning, and, the same thing happened, only according to 1 Samuel 5:4. The head and the palms of his hand had broke. So all that's left is his trunk. So that was a slight problem. So they figure, you know what, we better get rid of this Ark of the Covenant because it's a problem. And so they send it to different Philistine cities. There are 5 Philistine cities. I think it makes it to 4, if I remember correctly. And then they say, okay, we got to get rid of this thing. We're getting sick. It's not working. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to put the ark on a wagon. We're going to have 2 milk cows. Bring the ark, or attach them to the cart. They are going to have calves. We're going to wean the calves, and we're going to see which direction the cows go. Are they going to go into Israel, or are they going to go after their calves? Now, think of your mothers, or some mom figure. If a mom's child is taken from her, what is the mom going to do for the most part? She's going to fight tooth and nail to get that kid, right? So same with the cows. Okay, cows don't want to be separated from their babies, and so they're going to do everything they can to get back to their babies. But what happens, so the Ark of the Covenant is put on this cart, the cows are hitched up, their calves are taken away, and the cows go into Israel. And they're lowing, they're moving, their babies are crying for them, but they still go into Israel. So the Philistines know that it is Israel's God that has done this. So Shiloh was where the tabernacle was. God set his name in Shiloh. But Shiloh is no longer the holy place. So guys, you're counting on Jerusalem. Okay, God doesn't have to stay here, right? So just like Shiloh, it went down. It can go down again. Now, if you are an ancient Israelite, and as we look at different things in Jeremiah, he eventually tells them, you know what? You guys need to give up to the Babylonians. Let's go to Jeremiah 28 and 29. So in Jeremiah 28, there is a prophet who speaks, the guy Hananiah, and he says, this is what the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, says, I have broken the yoke of the king of Babylon. Within 2 years, I'm going to bring back to this place all the vessels of the Lord's house, which Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, took away. I'm going to bring back Jeconiah, also known as Jehoiachin on your timelines, king of Judah, and all the exiles who went into Babylon. So this is after the second exile. And the prophet Jeremiah says, yeah. Look, verse 6. Yeah, may the Lord do so. Yeah, okay, that's cool. Yet hear the word that I'm about to speak. Verse 8. The prophets who were before me and before you from ancient times prophesied against many lands. The prophet, verse 9, who prophesies of peace, when the word of the prophet comes to pass, that prophet will be known as the one whom the Lord has truly sent. So, okay, let's wait and see if what you say is going to come to pass. Didn't make Hananiah very happy. Jeremiah had a yoke around his neck to show figuratively that they're going to be under Babylon's yoke. That's their future. And Hananiah breaks that and says, nope, thus says the Lord, even so I will break the yoke of Babylon. Now, if you are the prophet Jeremiah and you say, give up, how popular are you? So say the Canadians are going to come and attack us. I like Canada. My dad, his family, they're all Canadians, so Canadians aren't really bad, but just pretend the Canadians are going to come down and take out Bemidji. What are we going to do? Give up? What if God says we're supposed to give up? Are we going to give up? They might take us. There are places that have a relative that lives in Swan River, way in the north. Way in the north. I mean, we think we're north, but it's super way up in the north. They might send us up there to Swan River or Yukon Territory or something like that. Basically, you're going to be cold all the time. Would we say, oh, that's cool. Okay, I'll give up. What do you think? Now, what should we do? Give up, right? Because this is from God. Now, why is God taking them out? Because he hates them? Are they currently living for God as a whole? No. So he's trying to get their attention. And then when we go into Jeremiah chapter 29, Jeremiah sends a letter. He's in Jerusalem. He sends it to the people that are in exile. And he sends them, like a word of encouragement. In verse 4, this is what the Lord says. So verse 5, build houses, live in them, plant gardens, eat their produce, take wives, become fathers of sons and daughters, take wives for your sons and give your daughters to husbands that they may bear sons and daughters and multiply there and do not decrease. Seek the peace of the city where I have sent you into exile and pray to the Lord on its behalf. For in its peace you will have peace. Now, what is that saying? Verse 7. What does it mean to seek the peace of the city that you're currently living in? Where are these people living? In Babylon. Who wants to live in Babylon? Do they want to live in Babylon? No, they want to go back to Judah, their homeland. But they are told to actually seek the peace of Babylon. Settle down. You're going to be there for a while. And pray for Babylon. Okay? Because if it goes well for Babylon, it will go well for you. Verse 8, don't let your prophets who are in your midst, your diviners, don't listen to them, because you're going to be there. 70 years you're going to be there. Okay? You're in there for the long haul. It's not just going to be a pop over and pop back. Verse 10, when 70 years have been completed, I will visit you and fulfill my good word to you to bring you back. And then we have this verse. So look at the context. Think about the context of verse 11, which we usually use for graduation cards. I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare and not evil, to give you a future and a hope. Then you will call on me and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you. You will seek me and find me when you search for me with all your heart. Now, if you are Jeremiah and you say, you know what, give up. He says it consistently as you read through Jeremiah. Give up, give up, give up, give up, give up. This is what God has determined. He needs to get your attention. This is how he's going to get it. He's going to allow you to be conquered by the Babylonians. And you are a person living in Judah, in Jerusalem, and are you going to say, yeah, I want to be on Jeremiah's side? How popular is that message going to be? Like not, right? People want to kill Jeremiah because of his message. It's like, that's not encouraging. You need to rally the troops so we can fight against the Babylonians. But Jeremiah consistently brings the message where God says you're going down. Okay, this is it. You've had your chances. You're not listening to me. I need to get your attention, and this is how I'm going to do it. So he hits on side the head with the 2x4, brings it up to a 4x4, a little bit bigger. Let's just double it, 4x4. We'll make it an 8x8. I don't know, they don't really make those in wood anyways, that I know of. So a huge beam, right, going to knock you upside the head, and still you're not listening to God. So what does he have to do to get our attention? He has to bring the hammer down, right? Because we're so dense, we're not listening to what. So this is what's happening to the people of Judah. And when we get to the post-exilic time, we're going to see how well they did, okay, if they got it or not.
Even in this rebuke that they're suffering, he's expressing his love for them.
Yes.
Because he's saying, be peaceful.
Mm-hmm.
Have your families, live the
Yes.
best life you can. He's looking out for them.
Yes, yes, yes. And the people in Judah are headed off a cliff, right? Because they're not going, and he's pulling out everything to get their attention. Yeah, right. And yeah, exactly. He's not forgotten them, even though they're not in Judah. Yeah. I just think as we continue to look at the Old Testament, we see so much of God the Father, I would argue. We know God better, the first person of the Godhead, by reading our Old Testament. If you look at the New Testament, it doesn't talk as much about God the Father, the first person of the Godhead. The people in the New Testament are building on what they already have. So you learn a lot more about, obviously, God the Son and more about the Holy Spirit. But people in the New Testament really are basing what they know about God. 1 John, God is love. Well, how do you know God is love? Okay, yes, he sent his son. Is that all you have to go on? No, you have all the Old Testament that gives pictures over and over and over of God and who he is. So, exactly, yes. Go.
Just a couple things I noticed just in this little bit that we read is, we say about how hard it would be to listen to what Jeremiah was saying in the sense of giving up, because especially when you say 70 years, I think for a lot of those people, they knew they wouldn't live
Yeah.
to see the return.
Yep.
If they were going to be there for 70 years.
Yep. Yep.
But another thing that caught my eye, and I've read this before, and I always was like, oh my, they're to take, take wives and become the fathers of sons and daughters, and take wives for your sons. Am I right, as I look at this now, it is within their own population, not
Yeah.
taking wives or obtaining wives of Babylonian.
Right.
So we have to read it as they will marry, Israelites marry Israelites.
Yes. Yes.
To keep it holy. The one other thing I noticed back in 28 at the end, remember yesterday we were talking about how to know if a prophet was right or wrong?
Yep.
Well, here, God gives Jeremiah the words there in 15 to the prophet said to Hananiah the prophet, listen now, the Lord has sent you and you have made this people trust in a lie. So he was saying this is from God, but he turned the people away. And so God, in 17, the prophet died. And that was one of the ways that you knew, that was a consequence of knowing a false prophet. So I
Yeah.
found that very interesting.
Yes. 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 Yes.
I have a question about, like, say, when Jeremiah is speaking to Hananiah, that isn't face-to-face communication, I would assume. It is?
It seems to, because it seems that as we read, see in verse 10, Hananiah breaks Jeremiah's yoke. So they have to be physically in the same place, right? And they're actually in the temple, because in verse 1, Hananiah spoke to me in the house of the Lord, in the presence of the priests and all the people. Yeah, so this is a public confrontation. Yeah. And again, Jeremiah's message wasn't popular because who wants to hear? Zedekiah, the last king, I'll just jump down to Zedekiah. Zedekiah in Jeremiah 21, notice that he actually seeks a message from the Lord. And he talks to Jeremiah and wants to make this the right way. He kind of wants to know what is it that God is doing here. But Zedekiah is very wishy-washy. He just goes up and down. He doesn't fully, he believes Jeremiah, but yet he has him imprisoned, and Jeremiah is thrown into a cistern. And so Zedekiah isn't a strong king at this point. Pretty wishy-washy. Now, we've talked about hope. There's always, 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 always hope. So turn to Jeremiah 33. Well, Jeremiah 31 through 33 have a promise of a new covenant. And sorry, can you go back to 31? Jeremiah 31, 31 through 34. So Jeremiah chapter 31, verses, well, it starts in 27, but in 31, behold, days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new or a renewed covenant. So in Hebrew, the word new can also have the idea of renewed. So a guy named Walter Kaiser argues that it's not a new covenant, that we see, and eventually this will go through the New Testament, it's actually a renewed covenant in the sense that if this portrayal of Israel is correct, God isn't like totally changing what he's doing and doing something different, but he's working his plan. So in that sense, it would be a renewed covenant. So sin happens way back in Genesis chapter 3. The world is now broken. God cares that people are broken, right? So he is working a plan to eventually restore people so it'll be like the Garden of Eden. And so he's working his plan, and he has these different covenants, like he has the Davidic covenant. Well, who is eventually connected to the Davidic covenant? Jesus, right? Jesus is the ultimate David. So he's not, as I look at it, I don't see God like just doing an about face, changing things, doing things differently. He's always looked for the heart, always wants the heart. Where is a person's heart? The person's heart needs to be sensitive to the Lord. And so the problem that we have is our hearts are broken. And so maybe the sense it's a renewed covenant where God is continuing to fix what's broken. And so in verses 31 and following, so it isn't in verse 32. So in this sense, it's not like the covenant made back in Egypt. But what is it? Verse 33, I will put my law, my Torah, my instructions within them, and on their heart I will write it. And I will be their God, and they will be my people. They will not teach again each one their neighbor and each their brother or sister, saying, know the Lord, for they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest of them, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquity, and their sins I will remember no more. So something is going to change, okay, inside of us, so that we are not going to be broken like we currently are now. Ezekiel talks about a similar idea, and in Ezekiel 36, verses 26 through 27, Ezekiel 36, 26 through 27, Ezekiel writes, God will give them a new heart and put a new spirit in them. So it's going to be different. So whatever was broken, I don't know how it all works, but obviously in Genesis, people had a defect somehow, I guess, because they broke God's law, right? They sinned against God. And so however it's going to work, God's going to give us a new heart. It will now be different when we hit heaven. I don't know what that looks like, but that's what it says.
When we read these, the covenant seems to be the same. You know, I mean, it's not when he describes what he's going to do. It is consistent. It is the same.
Are you in Ezekiel, you mean?
Well, even in Jeremiah, Ezekiel, all of them, he says about it.
Yep.
I mean, when he gives the details of it,
Yep.
they are the same thing.
Yep.
Is it that we have repented and are open, and now we are a new person to be able to live that and see it now with eyes open and ears open? Is that, you know?
No, yes, but in the sense, but now we can't do it completely, right? Because, we sin, just like Paul writes, there's this war going on inside of us where, yes, we want to do what God says, but yet we also are tugged and tempted by sin, and we regularly fail and sin in all sorts of different ways. And so it seems like somehow when we get to heaven,
It'll be the ultimate, the final time, but
yeah, and we're not going to be have that sin desire like we have now. So yeah. So we'll have, right, whatever that looks like, right? But that's pretty cool, isn't it? Look, and this is in the Old Testament. You don't even have to go to Revelation to find it. So, yeah, so again, God is working his plan. And as you continue, the Old Testament has a lot of stuff about what things are going to look like in the future. But a lot of what the Old Testament, and I'd argue the New Testament, is concerned with is come back to me. Okay, come back to me. You're out to lunch. God doesn't spend a lot of time on heaven. Once I did a sermon, and I was supposed to talk about heaven, the end times. And so I went through the Old Testament and tried to find out what I could about heaven. And it was kind of skimpy. I mean, in the sense that we're going to have a new heart and things like this. But it seems like God spends more time talking about get your act together in the here and now than he does in saying, up in heaven, you'll be able to play basketball and you'll never miss a shot. You'll be able to, shoot from the half-court line. You'll make it every time, just a nice swish or something like that. It doesn't tell us those things. I mean, what are we going to do in heaven? We'll be with God, which that's the most important thing. So, I don't know that I totally think that now because I don't get it. I don't understand. I don't fully understand God. But it's more concerned with how we live in here and now. So the prophets, guys, you're off base. Get back on track. Get back to the Lord. New Testament is kind of the same. It doesn't really give us a lot of information about heaven, right? Revelation talks about streets of gold. But the big thing is God's going to be there, and we're going to, not sin anymore. So as I see it, the Bible is more concerned with what we're doing now, how we're living our life now, instead of giving us all this information about heaven. Because right now what's important is how we're living for him. So ancient Israel, God knocks them upside the head. He does give them hope. There is hope. Okay, yes, there is heaven. Okay, that's there. And so that needs to be enough to encourage people to desire to be obedient to him in the here and now. So God is going to eventually give us new hearts. And so that section, Jeremiah 30 through 33, is often called the Book of Comfort. I don't remember if I have it in my slides. Anyways, there we go. Called the Book of Comfort because it gives the hope that there is for the future. That at some point in time, things will be different. Okay, so that is Jeremiah. Comments, questions?
It just seems, excuse me, too, one of the things, you can't help but notice in the Old Testament is it does set forth a lot of principles.
Yeah.
Jeremiah 29:11, sure, it was about restoration of the land.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, it's a principle that applies today,
Yeah.
to those who are in Christ.
Yeah. Right, it looks a little different how we serve God today, but exactly when you drill down, so when I talked about the law last time, a lot of times Christians will kind of chuck the law and say it doesn't have anything to say to us today. But I think what you do is you go beyond the surface. They had to build a rail around the roof. Okay, you go beyond the surface, and what can you learn about God? Because all these things are based on who God is, why he's putting these things into place. And so you build a rail around your roof in Old Testament times because you did a lot of stuff on your roof. You had tiny little house. I mean tiny, okay, tiny. You would want to be outside a lot. Tiny, okay? So tiny little houses. So your roof was another place where you could do things. Remember, Rahab had her flax on her roof. So you built a rail to keep it safe. Why does God give them a command to build a rail around their roof? What's he concerned about? That they're safe, right? And so bring that principle into today. How do we make our places safe? What kinds of things do we do to make our living spaces safe? Okay, we put railings on the steps so somebody can have something to hang on to when they go up the stairs. We put rails around our second floor, or if a deck is so high off the ground, you need to have why? You can't then just jump off the deck at any point. Or the dog can't jump on and off, or whatever. So it's kind of a pain sometimes. So why do we make people build rails? Who don't we want to fall off? Little kids, right? Because then you have to have your slats only so far apart, because a little kid can get through their fall, they could get really hurt. So it's the same kind of idea. And so sometimes we get stuck because we think build a rail around your roof, that's the dumbest thing in the world. In northern Minnesota, you're not going to do that because that'd be stupid. You want more ice dams up there? No, you don't. So see, the Old Testament just has all sorts of dumb things, doesn't have anything to say. But it's God who's underlying it, right? And all these things that we're reading about in the Old Testament, what happened to them, but how do we see God as we go through, the Torah, these things that we're going through? Hopefully we'll see God and get to know him better as we see how he treated people back then. So that's my big passion, right? That we get to see God at work. Yeah. So, comments? Okay, well then let us move on to the book of Lamentations. How many of you like the book of Lamentations? Yeah, because what's a lament? Yeah, sorrow, right? Complain. Things are not going very well. I shouldn't have done that. Right. So Lamentations. Oh, sorry. I forgot one thing. Let's talk about what's called the Confessions of Jeremiah. So Jeremiah is unique among the prophets in that he has 5 confessions. I don't know why they call them. Well, confessions in the sense he's talking to God and saying, my life is rough. This is difficult. People hate me. Okay, so 5 of those. And it helps us to see what it would be like, well, to see his life in particular as a prophet. So, just briefly going through them. So Jeremiah 11 through 12, 6, 15. You can see in a lot of these confessions, people, they hate Jeremiah. They're devising plots. They want to kill him at different points, take him out. And so Jeremiah prays to God. A few times he asks vengeance to be taken on those who are persecuting Jeremiah. Again, Jeremiah is simply giving God's words. People don't want to listen to what God has to say. 15 even has a woe about being born. Again, this guy's life is rough. In Jeremiah 20, he talks about being a laughingstock, yet he can't quit being God's spokesperson. Even if he wanted to, he can't quit. Remember, he was called by God at a very, 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 very young age. So he's been a prophet for many, 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 many years. And in verse 9 of Jeremiah 20, if I say I will not remember him or speak any more in his name, then in my heart it becomes like a burning fire, shut up in my bones. And I am weary of holding it in, and I cannot endure it. So these personal confessions, that's what they are. They're personal confessions. So the confessions of Jeremiah. Okay, then Lamentations. Lamentations is what's called an acrostic. So we have acrostics in poetry in English. Now, I'm not a very big poetry person, so some of you probably know more about that than I do. But like a ABC poem or something, that was the only kind of poem I could write in high school. I remember I had to write a poem, and so I could do that because it was bad, but you just have to come up with different words for the different letters of the alphabet. So I could do that. So it wasn't good, but it was done. So if you look at the book of Lamentations, Lamentations is credited with Jeremiah being the author because it says in Kings that he lamented over Josiah when he died, but the book of Lamentations does not indicate who actually wrote Lamentations. There may be 5 different authors. There's 5 different chapters, 5 different poems in Lamentations. There might be, so who knows? Not really 100% sure who wrote it. But when you look, so turn in your Bibles, how many verses are in Lamentations 1? I know I tell you, but it's always good to look at your Bibles. It cements it more. 22, right? How many verses in chapter 2? 22. How many in chapter 4? How many in chapter 3? Okay, I'm messing you up. How many in chapter 3? 66. How many times does 22 go into 66? 3. Okay, this is called, Lamentations is a big acrostic. So there are 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet, and they are listed on both sides. Well, no, they're not. I only go Aleph through Tet. Okay, they're not all listed, sorry. 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. So this acrostic in chapter 1, the first word begins with the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Chapter 2, the first word begins with the second letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and it goes all the way through the Hebrew alphabet with the first word in that verse beginning with the next letter of the Hebrew alphabet. So chapter 1, chapter 2, and chapter 4 follow that pattern. And Lamentations is all about Jerusalem has been destroyed, and they are lamenting Jerusalem's destruction. And they have a bunch of questions about what God was doing at that point in time. Now, so, can you guys, see this up here? Yeah, you can. Oh, okay, cool. Okay, so, see, these are the letters of the Hebrew alphabet. So, in these chapters, this would be verse 1, verse 2, verse 3, verse 4, blah, blah, blah. They all begin. Now, in chapter 3, now you have 66 verses. So now you have 3 verses that begin with the first letter, 3 verses begin with the second, 3 that begin with the third, etc. So it's really an extensive acrostic. So they would do these kinds of things in Hebrew poetry. Exactly. Yes. Yes, if you wanted to look, I brought my Hebrew Bible today. So if you wanted to look at Lamentations during our break, I could show you and you could see how they all begin with the different letters of the Hebrew alphabet. Yes. Yes. Then chapter 5 also has, how many? 22, but it's not an acrostic. Okay, so it breaks the pattern. So you would think it would be, but it is not an acrostic. Now, what is Lamentations all about? Destruction of Jerusalem. Okay, so America is God's country, right? Say what? The whole earth is, right? Sometimes we think America, God really likes America, right? And so what would people think when, in particular, Israel, because God's house was in Jerusalem. We have houses of worship, houses of God, but this is different in the sense that God himself picked the place, Jerusalem, told Solomon to build the temple, etc. Okay. Your city, your temple is destroyed by the Babylonians. Where is God? Okay, because we are the good guys. God is the God of the universe. And why did the Babylonians come and take out our city, our house of God? What that represented in the ancient world is the Babylonian deities were stronger than your deity. So God lost to the Babylonian deities. Now, is that how God sees it? No, who's in control? God. In Isaiah 10, it talks about God using Assyria, the nation before Babylon, as a rod of his anger. So as we, and somebody said this to me, I think last night, that God raises up kingdoms and he brings them down. And he uses other nations as, in essence, his hands and feet to do the job. He often does that. So when we looked at Joshua and the Israelites then were who God used to punish the current people living in the land. Israel goes down. God uses the Assyrians to take out the northern kingdom because they are sinning against God. Jerusalem, Judah is unfaithful to God. God raises up the Babylonians to take out Judah. So you see that throughout the Old Testament, how God uses different nations to inflict punishment on his people. So Lamentations, they are wrestling with the idea that God's house has been destroyed, and how could he do this? Lamentations 2:7, for example. The Lord has rejected his altar. He has abandoned his sanctuary. He has delivered into the hand of the enemy the walls of her palaces. They have made a noise in the house of the Lord as in the day of an appointed feast. And notice in chapter 2 in particular, in verse 1, it talks about the day of his anger. And in the last verse in chapter 2, verse 22, it's in the day of the Lord's anger. So that's called the inclusio. It's like an envelope. It helps people to see that this is one poem and it all goes together. And in the day of the Lord's anger, the day of the Lord is when what? In the Old Testament, what's the day of the Lord? God is bringing the hammer down and punishing. And this is the day of the Lord on Judah. And they didn't really expect that the day of the Lord would be on Judah because are Babylonians nice people? They worshiping God? No, so they should be punished. But God says no. Okay, you guys need to be punished. So Lamentations overall is a lament, obviously. That's why it's called Lamentations. And a lament over the fall of Jerusalem. But again, there is always hope. So go to the middle of Lamentations. So I did my dissertation on Lamentations. And people argue about where the main point, the center of Lamentations is. A lot of times when we read books or something, you want to get to the end to see how everything ends, okay? You get to the climax. Sometimes in ancient poetry of this type, Israelite, Ugaritic, the climax would be in the middle, the main point. Okay, the thing you were supposed to get was in the middle. So scholars have argued that's what's going on in Lamentations. What is the main point? What is the thing that really is most important, what God is trying to get people to understand? Chapter 3 in the middle. So verse 21, this I recall to my mind, therefore I have hope. The Lord's loving kindnesses, chesed, his covenant loyalty, indeed never cease. For his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. So the author of Lamentations, if that is indeed the center, is remembering who God is and that he is faithful. even in the midst of their calamity. Their city, their temple is no longer. They're hauled off into exile. Life seems dark, but they need to hope in God. When you go to the end of Lamentations chapter 5 and look at, how does your verse 22 read? What do you have in Lamentations 5:22?
Unless you have utterly rejected us, and you remain exceedingly angry with us.
You all have something like that? Yeah. Some argue that it should be switched around and 21 should be the last, but when you read verse 22, is that kind of positive, uplifting? No, it doesn't have a happy ending, does it? No. So they are lamenting. Their city is no more. And so has God completely set them aside and he's done with them? Obviously, we know the end that God has not. But this is where at least whoever wrote Lamentations 5, they're questioning whether or not God has let them go. But if chapter 3 is the center, then however Lamentations was put together, that's what the author is trying to communicate. If chapter 3 is the center, who God is, his faithfulness, his loving kindnesses never cease. Okay, so let's go on then to Ezekiel. Ezekiel, how many of you like Ezekiel? One person. Oh, cool. You like Ezekiel. That's good. So, Ezekiel. Oh, I guess I better go faster. So, Ezekiel. Ezekiel actually lived in Babylon. It suggested that he went when Jehoiachin was his king for 3 months, and then Babylon took him to exile in 597. And a couple things in Ezekiel. Ezekiel witnesses the glory of the Lord departing. So in Ezekiel 8 through 11, he talks about what's going on. He has visions of what's going on in Jerusalem, and it is really, really, really bad. The things people are doing in the temple, it's just horrific. And so, sin everywhere. And so, in chapter 9, verse 3, it is time for God to bring the hammer down. And so, there's a vision of God then departing Jerusalem. So, it goes by stages. So, in chapter 9, verse 3, the glory of the Lord, of the God of Israel, went up from the cherub on which it had been to the threshold of the temple. So the glory of the Lord is moving from the Holy of Holy place and working on leaving the temple. In chapter 10, verse 19, now the glory of the Lord moves further, and it moves to the east entrance of the temple. And then in Ezekiel 11:22, the glory of the Lord leaves and goes to the mountain which is east of Jerusalem. So the Mount of Olives. And that would be, I don't know if that would have been a suburb of Israel, but for the most part, when you're at the Mount of Olives, you are on the very edge of Jerusalem. And so God leaves his people. He leaves his temple, so it can now be destroyed. It's now just a building. It doesn't have the presence of God in it anymore, as a figurative way to look at it. So Ezekiel, remember, he's in exile. He's over in Babylon, and he sees these things. A couple of things that God tells Ezekiel to do. He is supposed to be a watchman. So he's over in Babylon, and so he needs to communicate what God tells him to communicate. And what is a watchman? In ancient times, they used to have people that would stand on the walls and look for enemies that were coming. And then if an enemy did come, they had to warn the people. So that was their job. If they didn't warn the people, then they were responsible for what took place because they didn't warn the people. And notice in Ezekiel 33, God doesn't take pleasure in the death of wicked ones. This isn't something that he is excited about, but he wants all to practice justice and righteousness. So Israel will go down, but God really wishes that the wicked would turn from their ways. And Ezekiel's job is to warn them then. Just like a watchman needs to warn, but if you choose to ignore the warning, then that's on you. And then Ezekiel has this vision in chapter 37. He sees a valley. The Lord brings him out by the Spirit of the Lord, it says, and puts him in the middle of a valley. So whether it's obviously he's having some sort of vision. Whether he's in the middle of a dry valley, I don't really know. But he has this vision, and he sees all these dry bones out there. And there are a lot. And look at verse 2, it says, and they're very dry. And so God talks to him in verse 3, son of man. Ezekiel is often called by the Lord son of man. So it occurs a lot of times in Ezekiel. So, son of man, God says, can these bones live? And I answered and said, oh, Lord, you know. And he said, okay, prophesy over these bones and say, O dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. And thus says to God, behold, I will cause breath or spirit to enter that you may come to life. And I'll put sinews on you, make flesh grow back on you, cover you with skin, put breath in you so that you may come alive. And you will know that I am the Lord. Can dry bones live? Dead bones? No, they can't, right? Okay, not normally, right? Okay, but what happens? And so Ezekiel sees this, and he prophesies as God told him, and there's a noise and a rattling, and the bones come together bone by bone. So the thigh bone is connected to the leg bone and all those kinds of things, right? So all these bones come together. And what also happens, so you have all these skeletons hanging around. Oh, and there are actually sinews on them. And then flesh grows and skin covers them, but there still isn't any breath. So you just have all these human-looking people that aren't really alive. And so then God says, prophesy to the breath, prophesy, son of man, say to the breath, thus says the Lord God, come from the four winds, O breath, breathe on these slain that they may come to life. So he prophesied, and breath comes in, and they came to life, and they stand up, and they're an exceedingly great army. Okay, well, that's very interesting, right? But what does it mean? Why does God tell that to Ezekiel? And so God explains it. And he says, son of man, these bones are the whole house of Israel. Verse 11. Behold, they say, our bones are dried up. Our hope has perished. We are completely cut off. And say, no. This is what God is going to do. He's going to open your graves, cause you to come up out of your graves, my people, and I'll bring you into the land of Israel. What is that actually then saying? Okay, in Ezekiel, they are in exile. And God is taking out Jerusalem. Is there any hope? Are they ever going to get back to their home country? Or are they done? Lots of people go into exile, and they never come back. Okay, they're just assimilated. They die there. They never get back. But what is God saying? And come back literally and come back figuratively. Is God done with his people? No, he's getting their attention. Okay, he's disciplining them because he loves them. And so even though they are thinking that there's no hope. If God can make these dry bones come to life, he can make Israel come to life. So that's kind of cool.
Would this also be a near and distant fulfillment type prophecy?
Sure, in what sense?
Well, okay, he brought him back,
Yep.
then he scattered him again, AD,
Yes?
but then he brought him back in, well,
Yes.
especially the 1940s,
Yes.
or the 1900s, and then
Yeah.
48.
Yes. 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 I would see it. Right, because who would ever have thought in 70 AD that, or whatever, in 1948, that Israel would become a nation? Yeah, it was a miracle. Yeah, there are some people that think the church replaced Israel and God is done with Israel. I don't know. As I read the Old Testament, I don't know what it looks like, but it still feels like. And you read Paul in Romans 9 through 11, and it seems like God still is still going to do something with Israel. I don't know. But that is for a different day. Okay, so one more person is in exile, and that would be Daniel. And so Daniel was taken over in.
Just on the extended fulfillment, like, there will be a day when graves will literally be open.
Yeah, yeah,
Like, and people, like God's people will be in his land.
yeah. Yes.
The ultimate fulfillment is God's people return to the land from the grave.
Yes, true. Yes. Yeah, that'll be a miracle, huh? Yeah, that'll be cool. And remember when Jesus was resurrected, some people came back to life? I can't remember if it's in the end of a gospel or in Acts. And you remember there's a story in Kings, in some people, they were going to bury a body, and a marauding band came through, and they threw the body in the cave where Elisha was buried, and when the body hit Elisha's bones, came back to life. That would be the weirdest thing, right? So you're going to bury this person, you throw them in there because you're worried about the marauding band, you take off, and then this person comes back, hey, what's happening? I don't know, that would just be kind of weird. Yep, that's kind of cool. Okay, so Daniel has a lot of apocalyptic literature, and sometimes we maybe get a little too carried away in what we want to see in apocalyptic literature. And so there's kind of a continuum with prophecy on the far end and apocalyptic, and they argue that kind of the Old Testament revelation kind of is a blend of the two. And I remember when I was first saved, it was after I graduated from high school, and like A Thief in the Night was a big movie that was out, and actually one of my friends, he watched that movie and decided he better get his life right with the Lord. It freaked him out. And they have, and everything in, like the rapture, they have that all figured out. There's going to be a time when people are taken up, and the beasts are this and that, and everybody's trying to figure out this. Some people suggest maybe that isn't the best way to read apocalyptic literature, because in number 2 here, usually apocalyptic literature is presented in the form of visions and dreams, and the language is symbolic. So in the ancient world, they did use a lot of symbolic language, which means that not everything in the vision should be interpreted. There may be some parts of the vision that are just there because it to make it coherent. Just like in a parable, not everything has significance. Some things are there because they're telling a story. If you tell a good story, you have a lot of details, right? Some of the details may be significant, some might not be. Look for the meaning in the text. Don't invent meaning. And characteristics number 3, images are often forms of fantasy rather than reality. So fantasy might not appear in the items, so you have beasts, you have horns, but it's in how they are put together. So in Daniel 7, the 4 beasts represent future kingdoms. You have lions with eagle's wings, leopards with wings and 4 heads. Maybe not trying to figure out why the lion has eagle's wings and come up with all sorts of different things. But just realize, look at the text and see what the text says about this. Formally stylized, another thing is that they divide time and events into neat packages, and they like to use symbolic numbers. Daniel 9:24 through 27, it talks about the different weeks. And I remember when I was early Christian, they had it all figured out. 70 weeks have been decreed for your people. And so they took Daniel and they said that worked its way up until the time of Jesus. And so the time when Messiah the Prince came, there'll be 762 weeks. And then there's going to be another week. And there's going to be a firm covenant, verse 27 of Daniel, in the middle of the week. And in the middle of the week, they'll put a stop. So they said there's 7 years. There's going to be the 7-year period. The first 3.5 are going to be good. The Antichrist is going to arise at that point, and is going to fake people out, convince everybody that he's actually, or she, whoever, whatever gender they end up being, is a good guy. And then partway through, the true colors of this individual come forth. And so they looked at this, and maybe that's not exactly the way we should look at apocalyptic literature. But remember the big picture. What is the big picture of apocalyptic literature? They argue to encourage the faithful. In Daniel, Daniel is living in what country again? Babylon. Now, Daniel is a believer in the Lord, and is that a nice country to live in if you're a believer in the Lord? Can you do what you need to do as a believer? You do have some difficulty, right? So Daniel and his 3 friends, had some difficulty here and there, living in the land of Babylon. So, do you remember Daniel and his 3 friends, what happened to them? No, not Daniel. Let's do the 3 friends. Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. What happened to those people? Yeah, they're kind of like thrown in a fire. Now, sorry. So, how many of you have ever wanted to be burned alive? Yeah, okay, that's not. If I had to go in some bad way, I want to fall asleep in a snowstorm. Mm-hmm. They say that's not bad. I don't know how they know that, because if you actually died, it's not like you wrote your memoirs out or something before. Well, this is kind of nice, Anyways, okay, sorry, a little bit of a digression. So no, that wasn't really a good thing, but they knew that if they were thrown in the fire, it didn't really matter, because they were going to be loyal to God no matter what. Okay, they were not going to bow down, so Daniel chapter 3, they were not going to bow down to this image of the king and worship him, because that was against the rules. You don't worship anybody but God. And so Nebuchadnezzar, this is a huge statue. It's like 60 cubits high, which means it's 90 feet high. and 9 feet wide. So it's huge. And they had a few chances to fall down, but they said, we can't do it. And in verse 17 of chapter 3, they say, the God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace. And, he can do that. But even if he doesn't, we're not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image you set up. Now, you can imagine that made the king like super mad. Okay, really, really, really mad. And so he tells them to make the furnace 7 times hotter than usually. And they tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They throw them in the blazing fire. They have their trousers on, their caps. And they're thrown in there. And notice in verse 22, who dies? Not Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but the guys that threw them in. It was so hot, it killed the guys that threw them in. And then they're looking, Nebuchadnezzar is looking, thinking happy thoughts about the deadbeats that died because they refused to do what he commanded them to do. And he sees people walking around in the furnace, in the fire. And there's 4 of them. And he says, verse 25, wow, I see 4 men loose walking around, and they're not even burned up. And the 4th is like the Son of God. And so he goes and he calls out to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and he says, hey, come on out. And so they pop out of the furnace. And look at verse 27. The fire didn't affect them at all. Their hair wasn't singed. They didn't wreck their trousers. They didn't even smell like smoke. Now, you go by a campfire, and you smell bad, right? But nothing happened to these guys because God protected them. So, Nebuchadnezzar says, blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants, who put their trust in him. So therefore, he makes a decree that anybody who speaks anything offensive against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego will be torn limb from limb. Now, why would he do that? He's king, right? And he needs to be in full control. Why would he say, okay, don't speak badly against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Doesn't that not make sense? Yes, right? Shouldn't it not make sense? Because he told them they had to worship his statue. He's been pushed. But what does he do? Recognizes that there's a deity that is super strong in the case of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And remember, these ancient people, you had multitudes of deities. You had male and female deities, a lot of them. You usually had one. Babylon had Marduk as its high god, but you had a whole bunch of them that you also worship. So the religion, the faith of the Jews was really different because there was only one deity. That's it. No other deities you worshiped. Everybody else had numerous deities. It's expected you would worship deities, but Israel, only God alone. So Nebuchadnezzar at this point sees the power of the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and he respects that. And so he can just add it to his group of gods that he worships. Not a problem for him.
Isn't this an indication that God's Spirit is working on Nebuchadnezzar?
Yeah, it could be. Now, I don't know that Nebuchadnezzar is what we would call saved. I'm not sure if he ever did, but yes.
At the end, though, he says that, he's the God of truth.
Yes. Right. And he could say that and still include them in his group of gods, right? Because again, you were polytheistic in that world. So it was okay to throw another. And I don't know. I know what you're saying, because sometimes it seems like he does exactly what you're saying, gives allegiance to God, and therefore he would be, quote, saved. Yep. So not sure. Yep. Okay, so that's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And what is the job of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? What do they do for a living? Yes, they work for the government. Yeah, right? So in chapter 2, verse 49, the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are over the administration of the province of Babylon, and Daniel is in the king's court. So they are government officials. Okay. Well, let's go to Daniel in the lion's den in chapter 6. Oh, not that one. Here. So, in chapter 6, Daniel is supposed to, verse 4. Verse 3. Daniel is a good guy, and the king is planning to appoint him over the entire kingdom. Okay, so he's going to really be a high up person in the administration of the government. And other people are not happy about that. Okay, they're jealous. And so they want to figure out a way to get rid of Daniel. And they try to find some ground, verse 4, of accusation against Daniel. But they can't find any, because blast, the guy is faithful and he isn't corrupt. Like, he's a politician, and he's actually an honest politician, right? And they can't find any ground against him unless it's connected to his God. And so they have Darius make a command that nobody can pray to anybody except you for 30 days. If you do that, you'll be cast into the lion den, and it cannot be changed. So Darius signs this, and Daniel knows that this document has been signed, and he goes into his house, his roof chamber. He has windows that open towards Jerusalem, so he's praying to the west, and he continues with his open windows to kneel and pray to the Lord 3 times a day, just like he had always done. And they spoke to the king and said, hey, Daniel's breaking the law. And the king was not very happy. Look at verse 14. He was deeply distressed. He wanted to try and figure out a way to deliver Daniel, because the lions aren't pets. They would keep them hungry, obviously. They want the guys that are thrown in there, the people thrown in there, to die by the lions. And he tries to figure out a way, but he can't figure out any way to get Daniel out of this. So verse 18, the king goes off to his palace and spends the night fasting. So he's fasting for Daniel. He rises at dawn, gets right up, goes quickly to the lion's den, cries out with a troubled voice, my Bible says, and says, Daniel, servant of the living God, is your God whom you constantly serve been able to deliver you from the lions? And Daniel spoke to the king, O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths. They haven't harmed me, inasmuch as I was found innocent before him, and also toward you, king, I have committed no crime. So the people that were against Daniel, they were thrown into the lion's den, and that took care of them and their families.
Joseph in relationship to this, where, again, God
Mhm.
consistent way to put somebody in a position
Mhm.
within those governments in Egypt, in Joseph's case, in Daniel, in Babylonia.
Mhm.
But it just, when you were reading that, it made me think of Joseph as well.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, because obviously he was a high administrator. Suggested Joseph. He wasn't. It wasn't Pharaoh and second to him, but they have in other ancient Egyptian literature, you're described as being second to Pharaoh when you're like a vice president of an area. So probably Joseph was vice president of the granaries, which would explain why he was always there when his brothers came, because otherwise, how would he know? And so, yeah, definitely he was in a position of authority in the government, right?
So God places his people
Yep.
even within these other.
Yeah. Yeah. Right, because especially Babylon was Nebuchadnezzar was not a good guy, and the Egyptians obviously worship multitude of deities. So yeah, yep, yeah. So being a politician isn't necessarily, against God.
Right.
How do you maintain, like Daniel did, his belief in God and not cave? Because he should have died, right? The lions should have eaten him up. And does God always protect us out of difficult things? I mean, people die, right? You have martyrs who die. So you never know, right, what God's going to do. But Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego trusted God even though it looked hopeless for them. That's
Even
cool.
trusted that if God didn't save them from that, there was a reason, there was a plan,
Yes,
and they trusted in that.
yes,
Even if it meant their life.
yes, yes. Yeah, so that's pretty cool. Okay, so we have a few minutes before our break, so we'll pop over to the post-exilic period. So post-exilic, so it's after the exile. So these people now get to come back. So it's about them coming back. So Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, post-exilic, and there are the prophets, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. So the time is, we'll turn to Ezra. We'll start in Ezra while I figure out where I put that PowerPoint. Ezra. Nope, okay. So in Ezra, God stirs the heart of the people that are to come back. So Cyrus, he is king of Persia, and he gives people permission to return. So anybody that wants to go back to their homelands is allowed to return. Jews, other people that have been exiled by Assyrians, Babylonians. And so this is a picture of the Cyrus cylinder. And so this is a cylinder that he has written, so it's cuneiform script, and he allowed everybody to go back to their homelands. And in the case of the Jewish people, Zerubbabel and Yeshua are the first leaders to go back. And notice that verse 7 of Ezra chapter 1, Cyrus gives them articles from the house of the Lord, from the temple that Nebuchadnezzar had carried away from Jerusalem. And so they got a lot of things that had been taken from them when they were conquered by Babylon. Verse 9, 30 gold dishes, 1,000 silver dishes, 29, whatever, not sure what Hebrew means, 30 gold bowls, 410 silver bowls of a second, and 1,000 other articles. So all the gold and silver numbered 5,400 articles. So if those numbers are meant to be taken literally, that's a lot of articles that were given back. So notice Cyrus is very okay with people worshiping their deities. So they don't just have to worship his deity. Now, why would Cyrus be okay with that? Again, there are multiple deities in their religion, and what does he want them to do? Pray for him. Okay, so pray to your deity for me. And I don't know, but he's okay with sending the people back to their home countries. And so in Ezra 1:5, it talks about God stirred the heart of those who were to go back. And so what did they do? They started to build the temple. In chapter 3, verses 1 through 3, they're able to set up the altar. So they come back, and Jerusalem's a mess. It had been destroyed by the Babylonians. It had been uninhabited. And so the first thing they do is go to the temple area and rebuild the altar. And they offer a sacrifice, and they celebrate what's called the Feast of Booths to commemorate when Israel lived in tents. And that would be in the fall. Now, what else do they do? In verse 10, notice that they finish building the foundation of the temple. So they have to repair, again, the temple is no longer, it's just gone. So they have to start from scratch. So they build the foundation of the temple. And in verses 10 through 13, you see the response of the people. So people are excited, singing, praising, giving thanks to the Lord in verse 11. But look at verse 12. Many of the priests, Levites, heads of their father's household, old men who had seen the first temple, what are they doing? They're crying, right? They're weeping because they remembered Solomon's temple. And what they have here does not at all compare. So this temple that eventually gets rebuilt is nothing like Solomon's temple. Okay, it's very sad. Herod the Great fixes it up, and so it's pretty impressive by the time of Jesus. But before that, it wasn't much to look at, they say. So the Samaritans, the people that are living in the land, have been living in the land, the non-Jewish people are not very happy about the Jews coming back. They've kind of established their territory, worried about the Jews taking over and reestablishing Jerusalem, obviously then reestablishing their kingdom. So what happens is they actually stop working on the temple. So at the end of chapter 4 and verse 24, they stop working on the temple. So we're going to get the temple rebuilt. Let me go here. So 538, they return. That's the first return. And then, so they return in 538, and it's like 18 years that they stop building on the temple. So that's not a good thing. So in 520, Haggai and Zechariah received prophecies from the Lord. And in Haggai, it talks about things aren't actually going very well for them personally. They live in their fancy-dancy houses, paneled houses, verse 6 of Haggai chapter 1. They, go out and sow their field, but they don't really harvest very much. So what's the problem? You guys have your fancy houses. The temple lies in ruins. So get your rear end gear and go finish the temple. So the Lord stirs up Zerubbabel and Joshua. Zerubbabel is the governor, and Joshua is the high priest. And they rebuild the temple. Notice on there, Ezra 6:2-5, royal archives support the building of the temple. So the Persians are very gracious. They're very happy to support people rebuilding their places of worship. They'll end up praying for them. So it's a different king, Darius. And notice the total cost of rebuilding the temple is supposed to come from taxes. So that's kind of cool, right? It'd be like the government paying for you to like rebuild your church. Or, yeah, we'll just do the rebuild your church. And finally then, 4 years later, they complete the temple and they celebrate the Passover. And they actually have a few different times when they have returns. So 538 is the first one. Look, the temple is completed in 516 BC. So not until 458 do you have another return that's mentioned in the Bible. Look, Ezra doesn't even come back until 458. In the Hebrew Bible, Ezra and Nehemiah are actually one book. And then Nehemiah, he doesn't come back until 444 BC. Okay, so can I just do Ezra and Nehemiah, and then we'll come and we'll finish this. Will that work? Okay, yeah, no dissenting. Okay, big dissent. Okay, so just what I want to do, just talk about Ezra. He was a leader who came back, and he was big on the law. He was an expert in the Torah, and so that was kind of his response. And Nehemiah, then he comes back, and his job is to rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, because the wall of Jerusalem was broken down, and so he was a cupbearer to the king, and one of his brothers, and they think it's literally his brother, came back and talked about how sad things were in Jerusalem. They didn't even have a wall. You need the wall for protection. And so Nehemiah received permission from Artaxerxes to go back and help the people get the wall rebuilt. Now, he faced opposition. Again, people didn't want Jerusalem to be rebuilt. They didn't want that to, them to start up the government. But it didn't matter. The king allowed them to rebuild the wall. They were persecuted as they did it. When you read in Nehemiah, it talks about them having to hold a weapon in one hand while they built with the other. And so everybody was involved. It mentions some women that were involved also in helping rebuild the wall. So you rebuilt the wall that was by the section of your house. And so eventually, with all the persecution, all that was going on, they were able to complete the wall around Jerusalem in 52 days, which I don't remember if it was as big as David, but it was, David's city, they say, was about 10 acres. So 10 acres is a lot of wall to build, right? And you have to build it at a height that makes it so you can actually keep your enemies out. But for a while they had, they had to build with a weapon in one hand, and then they could use their other hand to build because they were facing some stiff persecution. But finally, 52 days later, not very long, and they were able to complete the wall around Jerusalem. Okay, so what we're going to do when we come back, we'll finish that last part of Ezra, Nehemiah, and their marriage things that they're doing. Okay, so we should take our break then for about 15 minutes then, okay? Do a 15-minute break? Okay, thanks. Okay. Okay, so turn in your Bibles to Nehemiah 13. So Nehemiah 13. So the end of the chapter, Nehemiah 13, 23 to 29. So in Nehemiah is looking around, and again, notice he comes back 444 BC about. So the first return around 538. So they've been in the land for almost 100 years. And in chapter 13, verse 23, he sees that Jews had married women from Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. So where is Ashdod? Yep. Sorry. So Ashdod would be Philistine territory along the coast. So by the Mediterranean. And where is Ammon? Ammon and Moab then. Yep, they're on the other side of the Jordan River. So, oh, hey, I can draw a map. Look at it, isn't that cool? Okay, so this is our map of Israel. And looks exactly, it's all to scale, just so you know. I can't draw. Okay, so what would, this is blue, it means it's a body of water. What would this be? And this? Yep. And this? Ha! Okay, you get bonus points if you actually know the Old Testament name. Nope. You're close. Chinneret. Sea of Chinneret. So I'll put Galilee so we know. Okay. So what did we have? We have Ashdod. So the Philistines. I'll use red. Philistines are over in this area. Yep. Yep. Nope. Gaza is part of the Philistine. And it might go a teeny bit further north in the Gaza Strip. I can't remember. But it's right there in the same. Yep. Because Gaza was one of the Philistine cities. So Judah, they're down here. Jerusalem would be here. So, what other, did we have Ammon? Did it say Ammon? Yeah. So Ammon is in here. Oops. And what was, did it say Moab? Okay, and Moab is in this area. Okay. So they're marrying people that are around them. Okay. And look at in verse 25. Look at what Nehemiah does. He argues with them, he curses them, he hits some of them, he pulls out their hair. What is the guy's problem? He is racist, okay? Because you can only marry within your family. You can only marry other Jews. You should not marry people outside of your nationality. Now, is that the problem? Does God hate people outside of the Jewish people? Of course not, right? So, what is going on? Can you marry a Moabite? Do we know anybody who was a Moabite in the Bible? Ruth, right? Ruth. Ruth was a Moabite. Ruth is the, I don't know, great-grandmother, great-great-grandmother. in genealogies, you can skip names. So, anyways, who eventually comes from Ruth's line? Starts with a D. Yeah, David. Yep, David. So Ruth is a Moabite, and she is married into the promised, whatever, the promised people, okay, the Israelites. Who else is a foreigner that marries into the Israelite religion that's a little bit on the famous order? Her name starts with an R. Go back before Ruth. Rahab, right? She is not Israelite or Judite, whatever. She is not Jewish. Where does Rahab live? She lives in Jericho. Okay, and Jericho would be right here in this area. It's by the Jordan River. And what is Rahab's job? Her occupation? She's a prostitute, right? And so why do we know about her? Remember the spies? Under Joshua, they spy out the land. They go to Jericho. They're checking it out. They come and they stay at Rahab's house. Now, she's a prostitute. Why on earth would they stay at her house? Because it would make sense, right, for guys to go to the house of a prostitute. Now, did they use their services? I'm going to argue no. But remember, Rahab, she supported the Israelites, said, I know that your God is going to conquer Jericho. And so remember me when you conquer Jericho and protect my family. Allow us to live, which they did. Now, when you go to Matthew in the genealogy, in Matthew, it mentions Rahab. We have Ruth being in the genealogy of Jesus. So is God against people that are non-Jewish? No, right? In the Old Testament, it talks about sometimes it'll call them foreigners. God cares about foreigners. God cares about people that are not from the line of Abraham and Sarah. So it isn't that God hates these people. So why does Nehemiah go ballistic? He curses them and he pulls out their hair. I mean, the guy's a grown man. And he just goes nuts. Why is he so bent out of shape that they're marrying people from these places? What do you bring in your marriage? You always bring your deities, right? You always bring your gods into the marriage. And so that's the problem. Why was Israel kicked out in the first place? Israel, Judah. Because, they worshiped other deities. Okay, that's why they're kicked out. Spells it out in 2 Kings, and we see it in Judah, Ezekiel. You read Ezekiel and the stuff that was going on in the temple. They're not worshiping God, or they're worshiping God in the midst of other deities. So God needs total allegiance. That's what he says. He's the only true God. The other ones are fake, false. So they get kicked out because they're not wholly devoted to the Lord. And now what are they doing? They're intermarrying people that live around them, and these people are going to bring their deities to the marriage. And look at what he says in verse 26, or what Nehemiah says in verse 26. Didn't Solomon, king of Israel, sin regarding these things? Yet among the many nations there was no king like him, and he was loved by his God, and God made him king over all Israel. Nevertheless, the foreign women caused him to sin. So, and it isn't just lower Israelites, regular Israelites. It is, look at verse 28. One of the sons of Joiada, the son of Eliashib, the high priest, was the son-in-law of Sanballat the Horonite, who he was persecuting Nehemiah. Actually, Sanballat did. Ezra and Nehemiah both get bent out of shape about these marriages, and they actually are required to divorce their wives. So Ezra 9 through 10. Same idea. And they've been unfaithful. And so in Ezra 10:3, let us make a covenant with our God to put away all the wives and their children, according to the counsel of my Lord. And so that's what they did. Yeah, go ahead.
10, talks about they made a covenant and how Nehemiah was the first on the list, so all these people committed, 4 essential things. One of them was getting a marriage thing, knowing that it would turn their hearts away. And so I know a lot of people get bent out of shape of Nehemiah's passion, but
Yes.
I don't, because in the sense that they said, hey, cursed be us if we fall from this covenant. We want to be held to this. We're going to
Yes.
sign our names to this.
Yes.
Because
Yes.
we are people of God.
Yes.
And if we stray,
Yes.
cursed be us.
Yes. Yes. And
It was fresh in their memories.
pardon me?
It was fresh in their memories.
Yes. Yes, yes, yes. Yes, because they just get back. And now they're being tempted to go back into the same sin that got them kicked out. But did they figure it out? When you go to the New Testament, does Jesus ever say, put away your Asherah, cut down your Asherah poles, put away your idols? Does he say that? No. Obviously, we always find other things to worship besides God, but they did not go down the road again where they worshiped other deities. They were loyal to their God. Jews today, they're people of the book, right? The book. Okay, so people of the book, the Old Testament. And so they are monolithic. They worship God. Now, obviously, we know as monolithic people, that doesn't mean our worship of God is perfect, okay? We have problems because we always put things above God, but not other deities. And so these guys had to take it seriously. They just came back, and now they're headed down the same path. They were willing to take drastic action. There were kids involved, okay? It talks about it in Ezra, that they had to put away the wives and the children. And is that going to be easy? Now, what if the wife wanted to worship the Lord? Did they have to divorce her? What if the husband wanted to worship the Lord? Did the wife have to divorce him? No, because it wasn't the fact that they were non-Jewish. It was because of the worship of other gods. It doesn't mix. It's God. He has to be by himself, right? And yeah.
Isn't this strongly parallel to when Joshua entered the land and God didn't tell him, go ahead and intermingle with these people and settle down? He said, purge the land.
Yep, and then they were to inhabit that land, and as I see it, that was kind of supposed to, well, it was supposed to be a land where, right, it was only God and God alone. So he has to purge the land, because how can you have garbage in your land, right? How can you have pockets of people worshiping other deities? It doesn't work if you want to be a nation, that follows the Lord God. So you have to clean it up, right? They were supposed to, they're supposed to kill all the people that were living in the land, because of that reason, because they worshipped other deities. And you read about them not doing it, and that's part of what happened then. Yep. So I don't know, sometimes these things, I think, seem to be kind of harsh, but what is the most important thing? Worshiping God, right? That is what's most important. So whatever it is that takes us away from God, we have to get rid of it, so that we can truly keep God number one. in Malachi. So go to Malachi, way at the end of the Old Testament. So Malachi prophesied during this time. And in Malachi 2, verse 16, it says God hates divorce. So if God hates divorce, why does he go along with Ezra and Nehemiah divorcing their wives? Because don't we throw out that verse? God hates divorce. But look at the context. Okay, yeah, of course God doesn't like sin. He doesn't like divorce, right? But in this context, what is going on? So at the start in verse 13, you cover the altar of the Lord with tears, Malachi, well, the Lord says, with weeping and groaning, because he no longer regards the offering or accepts it with favor from your hand. So why doesn't it feel like God is listening to us? And verse 14, you say, for what reason? But what is the reason? Why isn't God listening to these people? Because the Lord has been a witness between you and the wife of your youth, against whom you have dealt treacherously, though she is your companion and your wife by covenant. When you married your wife, in Old Testament times, you literally made a covenant with her. That obviously that you would remain married forever. And now what are they doing? They're wife of your youth. So the wife you married when you're young, I don't know, for whatever reason, you're tired of her, and so you divorce her. When we go ahead into the New Testament, you remember Jesus talks about the idea of divorce. And they come and ask him in Matthew 19, Pharisees come to Jesus, they're testing him, and say, is it lawful for one to divorce his wife for any reason at all? And he says, haven't you read? He who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no one separate. Then they go on and say, well, how come Moses commanded to give her a certificate of divorce and send her away? It's found in Deuteronomy 24. And Jesus says, because of the hardness of your heart, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning, it hasn't been this way. What's God's ideal plan? To stay married, right? A man and a woman, when they get together, get married, the idea is it's supposed to be for life. But we have a couple of different things going on in Nehemiah and in Malachi. In Nehemiah, this marriage is causing people to fail in their relationship with God. So if the wife or the husband in Ezra and Nehemiah's time changes and wants to devote themselves to the Lord God, do they have to get a divorce? No, because then the problem is removed. But if they continue to worship their deities, it cannot remain. You have to choose. Are you going to choose God, or are you going to choose your spouse, which is going to bring other deities into the marriage? You have to make a choice. Yeah, and a covenant was something that you took seriously. You didn't just throw it aside. And notice it talks about the wife of your youth. So they've been married for a while, right? And so in New Testament times, when Jesus was asked this question, they say that there were a few options as far as what some of the rabbis believed as to when you could get a divorce. One guy Gittim, they're basing it on Deuteronomy 24, where it says, when a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her. And he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out from his house. Okay, and then it goes on and talks about if she gets remarried and then something happens to her husband, he divorces her, she can't go back to her former husband. But it's what the rabbis paid attention to. She finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her. What does it mean he finds no favor in her eyes? So Gittim says she doesn't look as good as she used to. You know, she's got bags, wrinkles, you know, got a few more bulges than she used to have, etc. Okay, so that would be reason to divorce your wife. Hillel said if, you know, she burns the pot roast, she's not a very good cook, okay, that's a reason that you could, because that would be finding some indecency in her. Okay, she's not a good cook, or you're getting tired of her cooking or something. Shammai, he was a more conservative, and he said if she's unfaithful. So if she has committed adultery and she's unfaithful, then you can divorce your wife, which would go along with Deuteronomy more so. And so the idea, is you're married and you make a covenant literally with them. Yep, like God makes a covenant with his people. But in New Testament times, they suggest the idea was, again, they're getting tired of their wives and they want to find reasons to divorce her. Is that what's going on in Malachi? Maybe it's talking about the wife of your youth. So why do you want to get rid of her now and get another wife? That's not okay. You cannot do that. It's wrong to divorce your wife unless she's been unfaithful. So in the context, yes, God hates divorce. It's not supposed to be this convenient thing that you practice when you're sick of being married to your spouse. Okay, when you enter the marriage, it's meant to be a lifelong, till death do us part, covenant, contract. So that's what you're signing up for. So yes, God does hate divorce, but number one, in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, they would argue that God needs to be worshipped as number one. And so you need to take out those distractions.
So considering that was a patriarchal society, is there any flip side to this?
If the daughters were married to an unbeliever, they would have to get divorced too, or a pagan guy. But it went both ways. In this case, it went both ways. Yep. Yeah. So, now is God being? Maybe God is being. I don't know, egotistical, overbearing, conceited, or what? That he needs to be worshiped number one and nothing put before him? Is that true? And then we have to ask the question, why? Is it because he's egotistical, conceited? Why? Why does he need to be number one? What?
Because it's like best for us when he's number one.
Yeah, it's best for us, right? Who created us? God. Who set the world up? God. Who knows what's best for the world? God. So sometimes, okay, best for us. Now think about Jeremiah. We just looked briefly at Jeremiah. The guy had a bad life. Okay, people are trying to kill him. They hate him, etc. He gets thrown into a cistern. So bad life. Now, is that really best for him to do this? To live this life? Is that best for Jeremiah? And, maybe on one hand, it's really not best for Jeremiah because maybe he could live a better life, right? But yes, exactly what you're saying. God has a bigger picture. And sometimes what maybe is best for us, or maybe what we think is best for us, isn't best for God's big picture. Is this all there is? No, this is like a blip on the screen of eternity, right? And so God has things for us to do. Jeremiah had a bad life, I would say, because people are trying to kill the guy. They hate him. He's being persecuted. But that is what he needs to do for the Lord at this point in time, for a bigger picture that's not just about us. It's about God, his plan, and there are different people. Some people are blessed, have just totally wonderful lives. Other people are, like Jeremiah, persecuted. Other people are killed for their faith. Go ahead.
Also, Jeremiah, we were just talking about it when he was like, when I don't say the things that God has asked me to do, then I feel like terrible. And
Yes.
it's like burning inside of me. And
Yes.
so he has like, he knows from God that like what he's doing is right, so he can like still have that joy even though he's like living in like a terrible
Yes.
situation.
Yes. So, I don't know. I think sometimes it's hard. Well, sometimes my nephew thinks God's conceited because everybody's supposed to worship him. So we keep having conversations. So hopefully he'll come around there. But it isn't because he's conceited or egotistical or something. It's because he's the only true God. And Isaiah talks about that. He's the only true God. And yeah, this really is, like you said, best. Okay, any other comments? Okay, well then we'll do the last book in the post-exilic time, Esther. And what's one very unique thing about Esther? Nope, it doesn't mention the name of God. So I bet my niece, she didn't believe me. She was young at the time. And I told her, I'll give you $50 if you can find the name God in the book of Esther. Now, she's 23 now. So she was probably about, 10 to 12, something like that. So $50 was a lot of money, okay, back then. And so she looked, and yeah, she wasn't successful. So Esther never, ever, ever, ever mentions the name of God. So why is it in the Bible? Shouldn't it mention God? Is God at work in the book of Esther? Yeah, definitely. He's just behind the scenes, right? So, you know the story of Esther. In chapter 1, King Ahasuerus is having a banquet for his nobles. And they've been partying for quite a while. And so they're probably feeling pretty drunk. And he calls for his queen and wants her to, here, we'll look at this one. Wants her to go entertain them. And she says, nope. And so the guys talk. And they feel like verse 17, if the queen refuses the king and it gets known to these wives, then man, this is going to be rough for us. Okay, our wives are going to be in rebellion. So we got to look at this and do something about it. So Vashti is prevented from being in the presence of Ahasuerus. Notice Ahasuerus is Xerxes. So this line. So she's no longer queen. So I took care of that. But then after a while, he needs a queen. And so how do they go about finding a queen? Yep, go gather all the young virgins, so that very much a patriarchal society. Men are very much the top dogs in this society. So they prepare for their night with the queen, the king. So after her year of preparation, she would go spend her night with the king, and then the next morning she goes into the harem, and she may or may not see the king again. Verse 14, unless he liked her and summoned her by name. And so Esther, when she spends her time with the king, and she listened to the eunuch in charge, so and obviously God blessed her, right? Gave her favor before the king. He is the one, verse 17, that he chooses. So Esther becomes queen instead of Vashti. So all those other ladies that spent their night with the queen, they get to go home. Nope, no, they're now used goods. So they spend their life in the harem, may or may not get to see the king again. So thank goodness the United States of America isn't that way. That's not the way it works. So as a woman, you're not a piece of property like these virgins ended up being. Okay, so Esther. Chapter 3, we have the bad guy, Haman, who is promoted by king, so he's in essence second in command. And Mordecai, who is not exactly sure, he is Esther's relative because Esther's parents died, so is Mordecai her uncle or cousin. Don't exactly know because the Hebrew word, they're not 100% sure. But she is related to Mordecai. And so Mordecai doesn't bow down to the king, or to Haman, and give him honor. And so Haman wants to get rid of Mordecai. And so he comes up with a plan in chapter 3, and he goes to the king and said, verse 8, there's a certain people scattered and dispersed among the people in all the provinces. Their laws are different. They don't observe the king's laws, so it isn't in the king's interest to let them live. So if it's pleasing to the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed. And I will pay 10,000 talents of silver, that would be a lot of money, into the hands of those who carry on the king's business. So the king says, okay, we'll do that. And so they make a rule, verse 13, that they can destroy, kill, annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and children, in one day. Now, Esther then learns of Haman's plot, and she hasn't told the king that she is Jewish. But before she goes and tells the king, Mordecai encourages her and says, you know what, maybe you were put on the throne for such a time as this. And so she says, go pray, have people pray. I will pray and fast so that I might know what to do. So she comes up with a plan, and she's going to invite the king for supper. Now, in verse 11 of chapter 4, she hasn't been summoned by the king for 30 days. And if you go before the king and you haven't been summoned, you can be put to death. So the king has to hold out his golden scepter to you. So she's taken a risk. But, chapter 5, after they pray and fast for 3 days and nights, she goes, puts on her royal robes, and goes and stands before the king. And the king extends the golden scepter, and so she is okay. She can go and talk to the king. So what does she do? Invites him to a banquet. Food, right? That's the way to a man's stomach, they say. I don't know. So she invites him to a banquet. And Haman and Esther go, or Haman and Esther. Haman and the king go to the banquet of Esther. And I don't know if Esther chickened out or if this was good, because she doesn't do anything the first night, right? She just asks him to come again, okay, to have another banquet. And so that was cool. Now, in the meantime, Haman is really mad about Mordecai. And so they actually build, his wife is, and his friends say, you should make a gallows and have Mordecai hanged on it. So that's what he did. He had a gallows made. Now, look at this. In the night, the king couldn't sleep. He just so happened he couldn't sleep. And so he asked for the records to come and be read to him. And so as they're reading the records, it's discovered that this dude Mordecai had reported the bad guys who were going to take out the king, reported them, and obviously the king wasn't taken out. So the king says, hey, have we done anything to, honor this guy? Nope, nothing has been done. Okay, so then the next day, Haman is is in court, and so the king has him come in, and he talks to him, and he says, look at verse 6 in chapter 6. What is to be done for the one whom the king desires to honor? And so Haman thinks, oh, he's talking about me. This is cool. Okay. So, look, king. Okay, this is what you should do. Verse 8, bring and put a royal robe, which the king has worn, put it on this guy, and the horse on which the king has ridden, and on whose head a royal crown has been placed. And then let the robe and horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble princes, and he's going to help the guy get the robe on, lead him around on horseback through the city square, and proclaim, thus it will be done to the man whom the king desires to honor. Oh, that's a good idea, king says to Haman. Go do that for Mordecai. What? No, that isn't exactly what Haman was thinking, right? Haman was thinking, this is for me. Now he has to do his enemy, Mordecai. So that's what he has to do. And probably he was a little lackluster when he said, thus it shall be done to the man whom the king desires to honor. He may not have been too excited about it. Okay, so Haman goes back and talks to his wife, and it's like, oh man, what a bummer. Okay, so then Haman has to go back to this banquet now that Esther has again the next night. And so king once again says, hey, what's your petition? And verse 3 of chapter 7, Esther says, if I found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me as my petition and my people as my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. Now, if we had only been sold as slaves, men and women, I would have remained silent, for the trouble would not be commensurate with the annoyance to the king. And so the king answers, he says, well, who is he? A foe and enemy, she answered, is wicked Haman. Uh-oh. Whoops. Okay, Haman's in trouble. So the king arose in anger and went into the palace garden. Haman stays to beg for his life. Haman is falling on the couch in verse 8 where Esther was, The queen is angry. Will he even assault the king with me in the house? And so Haman was not well liked by everybody in the palace, because one of the eunuchs there said, hey, the gallows standing at Haman's house are 50 cubits high, i.e. 75 feet high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on behalf of the king. And the king says, hang him on it. So that takes care of Haman. Now, that takes care of Haman, but the problem still remains, because the king has issued a decree that on this day you can kill all the Jews. So Esther once again goes to the king and asks to be able to write to the Jews that they are able to fight back. And so she is able to write and that the Jews can fight back on that day, so they will not be annihilated. And so the Jews do not end up being destroyed. And so this begins the festival of Purim that has to do, Pur is a festival of lots, and so it's a celebration that the Jews still do. Verse 26 of chapter 9 talks about days Purim. So that is Esther, and again, God is not mentioned, but is God at work in the book? Yeah, he's behind the scenes, right? Yep. Yep, so if you ever want to get some money from somebody, bet them. See if they can find Esther in the book or find God in the book of Esther. Okay, well, maybe you shouldn't do that. So. Just kidding. Okay, so now how many of you like poetic wisdom books? Only one person? Seriously? Well, okay, so how many of you like history books? 3 people. How about prophet books? How many of you don't like any books? How many of you don't know what you like? Okay, so the poetic wisdom books we are looking at now. And to be honest with you, I'm not a big poetry person. So this is, but we'll talk about poetry here. So, Joe, do you guys like Joe? Okay, so let us look at wisdom literature. So in the ancient world, there is literature that they call wisdom literature. And let me see, it should be in here. There we go. So, wisdom literature. So the Bible has wisdom literature. Oh, what does it mean to be wise? If you think of a wise person, what's a wise person? How would you describe, what would your definition of a wise person be? Are they super smart? Like Einstein or something? Don't we think of Einstein? Do you guys think of Einstein as smart? Or not really? What?
Intelligent and wise, not necessarily the same thing.
Oh, are intelligent and wise the same thing?
Able to discern right from wrong or truth from falsehood.
Yep, there you go. So, right, exactly. So, wisdom in the Old Testament, yes. Actually, wisdom in the Old Testament has a few different uses. So, in Exodus 28, it talks about somebody who is wise of heart. Now, I would argue, I don't know, do you think we use the first one, technical skill or ability? Would you think of that person being a wise person? No, okay, so it's a little different. okay, in the Old Testament. So if you have a skill or ability, you can be wise of heart. So the ladies who were to make Aaron's garments were wise of heart. The workmen that were in charge of building the tabernacle were wise. So that was then their ability to do that job. So intellect, experience, but in connection with Hebrew wisdom, foundation of Hebrew wisdom is a proper relationship with the Lord. So if you look at Proverbs we could do chapter 1, Proverbs 1:7. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. And 9:10 is similar. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. What does it mean to fear the Lord? Yeah, does it mean to be afraid of him? Now, revere might have to be afraid because obviously God is God and we're not. But yes, it means to honor him. So when the Bible talks about fear, it doesn't mean literally be afraid, but to honor him, okay, to give him what's due him. Now, in Old Testament times, there were in the Old Testament world, they had a couple different kinds of wisdom literature. So they had proverbial wisdom and reflective wisdom. So Proverbs, the book of Proverbs, is an example of proverbial wisdom, in particular when we get into like some of these one-liners. Like, for example, Proverbs 15:1, a gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. So Proverbs like this are brief sayings. So, just a lot of these two-liner kind of things. And general truths are presented in black and white. Train up a child in the way they should go, and when they're old, they won't depart from it. Is that true? Always? Train up in a child in the way they should go, and when they're old, they won't depart from it. No, it's not true. Oh, yes. Okay. So, Proverbs, they're general truths, and they're general truths that are presented in black and white. Now, if you train up a child in the way they should go, will they often come back later on? Yeah, right? Is everybody going to? Not necessarily. A gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. If you are talking to somebody who's mad at you, when my mom had the Rainbow, the Christian bookstore in town, we would get customers that came in and they were just mad. One guy bought a Bible and it was defective. Okay, well, we didn't know that. It was defective. We wouldn't have sold it to him. But he was just angry, okay, because he thought we deliberately sold a Bible that was defective. And when we said, oh, we're sorry that happened, here, let's see if there's another one on the shelf, and we'll just give you that. Then he just deflated, okay? It wasn't a big deal. So oftentimes, if you don't put your dukes up and fight back, and you just give them a kind answer, it will turn away wrath, right? I mean, would you argue that it works that way? Any of you? Yeah. Yep. So it's generally true. It's not 100% because it's just presented in black and white. Now, one thing to notice, you have other nations that have Proverbs. So the Old Testament didn't come together in a vacuum. Just like the New Testament didn't come together in a vacuum. New Testament part of the Greco-Roman world, okay? And the Old Testament is a part of the greater ancient Near Eastern world. So they're doing things that other people are doing. So Egypt, Mesopotamia, they have different kinds of wisdom literature. It was a part of the broader culture. So Egypt has, scholars have found a few more proverbial writings in Egyptian literature. In fact, they have some writings, a guy named Ipuwer, that it suggested that maybe the author of Proverbs in chapter 22 was influenced by those writings. Could an author in Egypt be influenced by, could a biblical author be influenced by the Proverbs of Egypt? Why? Are they godly? Then why would Proverbs that are influenced by Egypt be included in our Bibles if they're not of our God? Oh, Solomon may have written some Proverbs, but not all of them. But yeah, why would we have Proverbs in here that some scholars suggest maybe even the author or whoever put Proverbs together just took some of these Egyptian Proverbs and put them in here because they're super close?
If you consider Solomon specifically, he had 700 wives. Where did they come from?
So maybe he was influenced by them? Maybe, right? And a guy named Arthur Holmes, he wrote a book and he talked about all truth is God's truth. Is that true? If something is true, will it line up with God's values? If it's true. I don't know. Today in America, we use truth maybe in a very fluid way. That's not the way I'm using it. If something is really true, will it line up with what God says? So, may other cultures have proverbs that are true? So, if in the Egyptians and the Israelites, as far as values, morals, at least what they said, they had a lot of overlap. So the Egyptians and what they saw was important, they had overlap. So if the author of Proverbs maybe is influenced by some of the Egyptian proverbs, it would be because they would be true in God's eyes, right? They would reflect truth that comes from God, right? But can the ancient writer be influenced by a non-godly person? Can you be influenced by a non-godly person not to do something rotten? Can a non-godly person challenge you and maybe it will affect your life for the good? Right. So they can say truth even if they're not totally lined up with God. Okay, so as we look at wisdom literature, the other cultures around Egypt or Israel had it also. So Proverbs tend to talk a big picture of life in general, and they're usually optimistic. Reflective literature, so they're reflecting on the way things are, and they're usually longer, like Job is reflective literature. And Job is really long, right? And again, they have parallels to reflective literature, to what we have in the Bible in Mesopotamia and Egypt. They have something called the Babylonian Job, where maybe I already said this later. Well, we'll get to it then if I didn't. But the Babylonian Job, it wrestles with the idea of good and evil, good and bad. So why do good people suffer? If bad things happen to me, does that mean I have angered some deity somewhere? So what's going on? So they wrestle with that idea. reflective literature tends to have more difficult life problems, like the idea of if I'm a good person, then the deity should bless me. Why is my life falling apart? Okay, that idea. Tone, Proverbs, proverbial literature generally more optimistic, reflective, more pessimistic. So we have all these things. Here's admonitions of Ipuwer. So that is an ancient Egyptian document, somewhere around 2000, they say. And it is wisdom literature. Ancient Egyptian belief, they would weigh the heart of the pharaoh against a feather. So if you look at this, so this would be Pharaoh's heart, and this is a feather. And if Pharaoh's heart was good, it would not weigh more than the feather. If Pharaoh's heart was bad, like he had done bad things, and bad things like what we would argue the Bible would say, then his heart would weigh more than the feather, and then this deity was ready to eat it up, and that would be the end of the guy. He wouldn't get to go into the afterlife. Okay, so let's see, 6, sorry, I don't remember what else. Oh, we just have other deities. Okay, so a proverb, listen to your father who fathered you, and do not despise your mother when she is old. So that's just a picture of an Egyptian couple. And notice the kids in Egyptian statues, if they're children, they're simply smaller, grown-up looking people. Okay, they just make them smaller. So that's kind of funny. Okay, so then let us look at Job, the book of Job. Okay, Job. So ancient Babylonian literature, again, we talked about this. And again, why does it seem like the good people don't do so well and the bad people seem to prosper? Okay, so go to Job 1. Job 1. Job 1. Job 1. So in Job 1, look at what's going on. So notice what it says about Job. Job 1, what kind of guy is Job? Yeah, blameless, right? Noah was blameless, right? Found favor in the eyes of God. This guy is blameless, upright, fearing God, turning away from evil. Is he on God's side or not? Yes, he would be a Christian today, right? Huh? Do you think he would be? Oh, okay. Okay, so good guy. And he has all these kids and he has all this stuff. And he would pray for his kids in case they accidentally did something wrong. And look at verse 6. There was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Hasatan also came among them. Now, who do you have for Hasatan? What do you have there in verse 6? Satan. Okay, in Hebrew it literally means the adversary. So it's the adversary. Satan as a formal name didn't happen until later. I don't remember if it's in intertestamental period or in the early church fathers. Okay, so it's the adversary, which, obviously we know ultimately is Satan. So the adversary comes and God talks to him and says, well, where have you been? Oh, just, wandering around on the earth. And the Lord says to Hasatan, hey, have you seen my servant Job? Man, this guy is a good guy. He is blameless and upright. He reveres God, and turns away from evil. And Hasatan says, Well, of course he does. Doesn't he? He doesn't. I mean, of course he fears you. Because haven't you made a hedge about him? Man, you have blessed him. He has so much stuff. Now, if you take away his stuff, he's going to curse you to your face. Just you see, he'll do that. And what does God say? Okay. Verse 11. Put forth your hand. You can touch all he has, but you can't hurt him personally, like physically. Okay, so verse 13, the next day, Job's kids are together in their oldest brother's house, and a messenger comes to Job and tells him he has all these messengers that keep coming and tell him all this bad stuff that's happening. Okay, the oxen are taken out, the sheep are taken out, the camels are taken out, and then in verse 18, then what goes? His kids. Yep, his kids. They all die. So Job arises, he tears his robe, shaves his head, falls to the ground, and curses God. Okay, well, that's the end of Job then, right? We're done now. Is that what he does in verse 20? What does he do? He worships God? How do you worship God when you just lost all your kids? But that's what the Bible says. That's what he does. Naked, he says, I came from my mother's womb. Naked I will return. The Lord gave. The Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Okay, well, so much for Hasatan and his idea. Okay, now in chapter 2, the sons of God come. Hasatan is also among them. And once again, the Lord brings up to Hasatan, where have you come from? Oh, just roaming around on the earth. And once again, the Lord says, have you considered my servant Job? There isn't anyone like him on the earth, blameless and upright. And Hasatan said, okay. Affect him now. Touch his physical body. Then he's going to curse you to your face. Okay, so the Lord says, okay, not a problem. Yep, you can do that, but you can't kill him. And so Hasatan goes out and does that, and Job is sick, and very sick. And his wife says in verse 9, curse God and die. Now, why does she say this? Is she done with God? Is she sad, hurting because of her husband? I mean, she has lost all her kids, and now her husband is super sick. I don't know why she says it. All we know is she says, curse God and die. Maybe she just wishes the pain would go away for him. But he said, nope, you speak like one of the foolish women. Shall we accept good from God, not adversity? And so in all this, Job didn't sin with his lips. Okay, so then his 3 friends come, and they sit on the ground. Verse 13, notice they sit there for a week, and they don't even say anything. They just sit with him in his pain. Don't feel the need to speak. But then they talk. First, Job talks. Verse 11, why didn't I die at birth, come forth from the womb, and expire? And this is difficult. This is hard. And Eliphaz, one of his 3 friends, the first guy to speak, he says, he does verses 4 in chapter 4, verses 7 through 11. Remember, whoever perished being innocent, or where were the upright destroyed? What does he just say in that verse? When are you destroyed? Are you destroyed if you're innocent? Are you afflicted if you're innocent? Does God bring bad things on you if you're innocent? If you are worshiping him? So what is he doing? Job's 3 friends, they all have the same idea. They argue, Job, the reason you are suffering is because you have sinned. You have done something wrong, and God is bringing suffering on you. That's why this has all happened. So repent, basically, is what they say. Seek God. Because obviously you did something wrong. So that is there. Oh, wait, back here. Right there. The Friends insist on, it's called the doctrine of retribution. So you get what you deserve. So if you are honoring God, what will God do for you? He will bless you, right? So if we honor God, he's going to send good things our way. This is a doctrine of retribution. You get what you deserve. If we do bad things, what's going to happen? If we stiff-arm God, don't do what God asks of us, then he is going to send bad things our way. Okay, you get what you deserve. In the book of Kings, it often talks about kings who were worshiping God, and they were blessed. And kings who went away from the Lord brought difficulty on them. So you kind of see it in the book of Kings. So this is the idea. This is what the other theologies, what we have in Mesopotamia, the same idea. If the deities are happy with you, you will be blessed. If the deities are not happy with you, then you will be cursed. So if you have bad things happen to you, you have done something wrong. Do you remember in the New Testament, the disciples talk about this Tower of Siloam that fell on people? Or it was a guy that was born blind, right? And it was who sinned? The guy or his parents. So the idea, if something bad has happened to you, obviously you are not pleasing God. And so God is afflicting you. Now, is that true? Is that correct? We just talked about Jeremiah. And it wasn't really working for him, right? Because his life stunk. So, erroneous theology. So, let us, and again, as you continue, you have all these cycles of speeches, and Job's three friends, in essence, say the same kind of things. Job, you've done something wrong. Confess your sin, and God will forgive you, and then things will look better. Job consistently insists, no, I have not sinned. Now, is Job correct in that he hasn't sinned? Romans says all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. So how can Job say he hasn't sinned? Yes, and when, oh, I'm sorry.
No, in all of our sinful nature, we don't leave a heart for God.
Yes, and I mean, it lays it out clearly for us in chapter 1, verse 1. He's blameless, he's upright, he's fearing God, he's turning away from evil. So this is a guy who takes God seriously and is living for God. Just like Noah was blameless and upright. Was Noah a good guy? Yes, Noah was a good guy. So some of the same words are used to describe Noah. So it isn't that Job has done something wrong and God is punishing him for his wrongdoing. So it goes back and forth. And then finally, when we get to chapter 32 in the book of Job, the young guy speaks up. I don't know how old the young guy is, but he speaks up. And so in 32, he says, verse 4, he had waited to speak to Job because he was years younger than they were, or they were years older than he was. So he was letting wisdom speak. But he was discouraged because they didn't really address Job's issue. They didn't really answer Job. They didn't have any wisdom that explained what Job was going through. And when people look at Elihu and his speeches, he argues, he doesn't answer Job's question in the sense of why is all this happening to me, but he talks like in chapter 34 and stuff, he talks about the wisdom of God. And basically that God is here and people are here. Verse 17, shall one who hates justice rule? Will you condemn the righteous mighty one? So God sees everybody and he is a just God. Okay, well, again, he doesn't really answer, but he says, you know what? What you have to do is honor God. Okay, and Job probably wouldn't disagree with that. And then God speaks to Job. So this is kind of cool. And now, if you had God speak to you, what would you want God to tell you? So pretend you're Job. So you're sitting there on the ground with sores all over your body. You've just lost all your possessions, all your children. Your spouse has told you to curse God and die. This is too hard. Your friends have told you you must have done something wrong. You made God mad somehow. What would you want to know? Why? Right? Why is this happening to me? So, God, tell me why. Does God tell Job why this is happening? No, he never tells him why. Okay, so as you look, chapter 38. The Lord answers Job, gird up your loins in verse 3 like a man, and I will ask you, and you instruct me. Were you there when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who set its measurement, since you know, or who stretched the line on it? On what were its bases sunk, or who laid its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together and all the children of God shouted for joy? Who enclosed the sea with doors when bursting forth, and when opened from the womb, when I made a cloud its garment, and thick darkness its swaddling bands? What's God talking about? Creation, right? Creation. Were you there when I created the world? Why does God say those things? Is God answering Job's question and saying why? Oh yeah, Job back there in the beginning, in chapters 1 and 2, I was talking to Hasatan, the adversary, and I was pointing out how cool you were and how good you were, and I allowed him to do all these things to you. Does Job find that out here? He never, ever, ever finds out. Why is God saying these things? He's talking about creation. And, I like this verse. Verse 22 of 38, he talks about, have you entered the storehouses of snow? Or have you seen the storehouses of hail? Like God has storehouses up there with snow and hail. Obviously, it's a figure of speech. We're going to argue. He probably doesn't have houses up there with snow because, he has, maybe it's the clouds, and you can refer to the clouds, right? Because they would be the storehouses of snow and hail. Why does God say these things? Is this helpful for poor old Job?
It's like Isaiah 55, except that it came a lot later.
Yeah.
But, it's almost like he's saying the same thing.
Yes. And so, end result is, so we'll just jump down there to the bottom paragraph there. It suggested that what God is trying to help Job to understand is basically who he is. That he created the world in wisdom, he governs it wisely. Okay, he does a good job in governing the world wisely, in justice, and with compassion. And also, he is in charge of creation. Okay, so he's the one that is in charge. And so ultimately, what is it, that you have to do? You have to trust, right? You have to trust. So Job repents not because he sinned in chapter 42. Job did not sin. That is not why these things happened. We know that God was talking to the adversary and they had a deal. You know what? There are people down there who love me, who will honor me, not because of what I give them, but just because, in essence, of who I am. And Hasatan says, no, that's not going to happen. And the book of Job shows, yes, it can happen because Job is upright. And he did not sin, even though his friends accused him of sin. And so Job says in verse 3 of chapter 42, I have declared that which I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. Hear now, and I will speak. I will ask you, and you instruct me. And so he repents because he talked about things he didn't know. And God then talks to Job's three friends. Elihu, he didn't blame. He didn't do the doctrine of retribution. Obviously, you did something wrong, so God is punishing you. Nope, that's not it. So Job actually has to pray for his friends, and God will accept their sacrifice. The Lord restores Job's fortunes, and he gets twice as many animals, and he gets 7 sons and 3 daughters, so he has more kids, and we know the names of his 3 daughters. In verse 15, in all the land no women were found so fair as Job's daughters, and their father gave them inheritance among their brothers. So Job got 10 kids again, so that fixed the problem, right? No. If you lose a sibling or a kid and you have another child, does that replace the one you lost? No, you still lost. You still lost the 10. Right? Now, some people would argue what we have at the beginning and end of Job were just added to this poem, and maybe Job was not. Maybe Job wasn't intended to be understood as a literal, historical, human guy that lived, and this actually happened to him. In other words, it's a story, a parable, and it's communicating God's justice. God knows what he's doing, and there wasn't really a guy named Job. Some people will argue that. If that is true, does it change the point of the story? No, it doesn't. So, I don't know. I kind of think maybe Job really lived, but I'll hold it in tension because I don't know. But again, the retribution principle is false. It wasn't true in the New Testament. It obviously wasn't true in the Old Testament. As we go through the Old Testament, you see that God, as we talked about, God does what he has to do, right? And sometimes people are blessed and they're serious followers of the Lord. Sometimes people are not blessed and they're serious followers of the Lord. Jeremiah had a bad life in one sense. But it's answering the question of theodicy, the justice of God. That's what that word means. So if God is all-powerful and God is good, why is there evil in the world? Is God all-powerful? Is God good? Is there evil in the world? Why? Huh? Okay, sin, right? The world is broken at this point. Now, God is going to fix it at the end. We have that in the prophets. We have it in Revelation. But at this point, it is broken. Bottom line, what did Job need to do? Trust that God knew what he was doing. Is that easy? Nope. But ultimately, God is a just, compassionate God, right? Exodus 34, 6 and 7, God is gracious, compassionate, long to anger, etc. Full of loving kindness, chesed. So he very much loves his people, but he has a big plan that he's working. Sometimes that means we need to suffer for the benefit of other people. Ultimately, this world will pass away, and heaven will be really different. But at this point, we may have to go through things for the benefit of others. Okay, comments, questions? Okay, well,
Anybody ever developed a timeline for the story of Job?
like when this and that. Not that I know of, like as far as put the book in order as that.
How long of a period did that take?
No, I don't think so because the friends sat with them for 7 days, but then once you get into the friends' speeches, there's no indication of how long it took. Yeah, you mean like, did it take a year? Did it take 6 months? Was it a month? Exactly. No, not any, because there's not enough evidence in the text to do anything intelligent with it. Person could guess, but. Yep.
You said bottom line, Job needs to trust God. In God's answers, I don't recall, does God ever saying, so you need to trust me?
No, in the sense that God judges the world with wisdom and compassion. So as you look around and you see order in the world, I'm the one, well, obviously not I'm the one, but God says I'm the one that did it. And can you trust me as you look and see how I have created the world and set things up? That's what they would argue.
I agree that is the like the inference. Like that's
Yes.
sort of the logical
Yes.
the application that Job sort of received. But I think it might be interesting that that's not what God is saying.
Yes.
But to me, God is communicating about himself.
Yes.
So Job is learning attributes of God.
Yes. Yes.
The action, the application of receiving that knowledge, there is an application that comes with it. And so it's not a command. God is not telling him to do this. God is communicating his attributes, and there is an action that follows that. And that happens so much. Like, I think knowledge of the attributes of God is the balm or the solid salve. Like, it's like a healing thing for us in times of anxiety or in times of temptation. Like, knowing about God has power to cause change in us. And so it's it caused this change without a command.
Yes.
Caused this
Yes.
change because it was the information.
Yep.
Like,
Yep. Yes.
like, so I just that is interesting to me.
Yes. Yes. Well, and that's why I'm passionate about the Old Testament, in the sense of we get to know, like you say, we get to know God better, and as we get to know Him better, we see better, more and more what He's like, and then that gives us confidence to trust Him, even if we don't get it. Yeah, exactly. Cool. Awesome. Anybody else? Okay, I'll pause back there. I think it's time for lunch. You going to pray for lunch? Or